And we'll move on to our next section. The next section is short-term and long-term post-fire recovery. And we have our presenter, Brad Schaffer. He's the director of Lacrette Center for California Conservation Science in UCLA. So Brad, if you want to share your screen and take it away.
I would love to do so. Thank you. Let me get my screen share up here. And I think that should get us somewhere. And well, that's the wrong place to start, isn't it? Hang on just a sec. Okay. So let's start there.
Perfect.
All good? Okay, great. Just writing down my time. So I will be a little bit apologetic right now in that I'm a little bit of an outsider to this group. So I hope what I have to say is interesting. Let's see how it goes. The team who have been working with me on this are two graduate students, Joey Curdy, who's a UCLA grad student jointly in my lab and the lab of Bob Wayne, and Richard Rackman, who's a very accomplished botanist and master's student at Cal State University, Northridge. And I want to start by just saying to you who I am and who I am not. So I'm a conservation biologist. I've been a faculty member across 3 different UC campuses, UC Irvine, UC Davis for most of my career, in the last 10 years, UCLA. I'm a landscape ecologist, I'm a landscape genomicist, and I'm a herpetologist. I study reptiles and amphibians. Who I am not a botanist, and I'm really not a fire ecologist. I've been sort of brought into it by necessity more than anything else. And I just want you to keep that in mind as I go through my presentation. So this is a slide. 10 years ago, I moved from UC Davis, where I'd spent a lot of my career, down to UCLA. And it was to head up a group called the Lacrette Center for California Conservation Science, as well as to be a professor here at UCLA. And part of that program was setting up a field station in the Santa Monica Mountains. As you probably know, the Santa Monica Mountains are administered largely by the U.S. National Park Service as the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. It's the largest urban park in the world at about 160,000 acres. And we, shortly after I moved here, we set up a field station, a very vibrant field station, had lots of visitors, lots of great research going on in the Santa Monica Mountains. And one of the things we did actually was do some fundraising and open a new building. Here we are with the ribbon cutting. There's on the left is David Szymanski, the superintendent of Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, as well as a number of other dignitaries. There's me in the middle helping cut the ribbon. And here was our new building with the beautiful landscape of the chaparral, largely chaparral community behind it that characterizes the Santa Monica Mountains. This was in early November of 2018 when we opened this second building. A week later, this happened. This was the Woolsey Fire. The Woolsey Fire came roaring over that hill. We had 25 students staying at this field station the morning that the fire came over the hill. We got them the hell out of there. The fire came down, burned our main field station to the ground, and took out a huge swath of the Santa Monica Mountains. Interestingly enough, if from this position you turned around 180 degrees, this was what you saw. Our new building, our little boutique building that we had just opened the week before, was untouched. In the foreground is the rubble of our main field station that is now completely gone. And one of the things you can see from this is that sort of moonscape of the post-fire landscape after the Woolsey Fire. Now, for me, this made that fire personal. This was my field station. I had worked for 8 years to build this thing and build up its clientele. We had hundreds and hundreds of students and researchers who had used it. I wanted to learn about this fire. I wanted to learn about the ecology of it. I wanted to learn about how it impacted the organisms that I study largely, which are small vertebrates, reptiles and amphibians for the most part. And when I looked at it, what I saw was this landscape where everything was burned. Many of the oaks looked like they were going to survive. Many of the other plants didn't. It was a torched landscape. And I just thought, how can anything make it in this? And it made me wonder a few things, two questions that were of immediate interest to me, given my research history. And for me, both of them were short-term questions that have long-term consequences. And the first is, I wanted to know what comes back immediately after the fire. And I mean, weeks to months after the fire. I wanted to know as a conservation biologist, heading up a conservation biology program at UCLA, I wanted to know, is it all invasives? As I said, I'm not a botanist. And my sense was that it was going to be all invasive annuals that come in. What about our native fire followers? Are they going to be able to make it? Are they going to be able to hang to sprout and come forward in this very modified landscape of the Santa Monica Mountains, which is surrounded, remember, on all sides, either by ocean or by the city of Los Angeles? What about annuals versus perennials? How is that going to work out, again, in the short term? And then how long does this take? Does it take weeks? Does it take months? Does it take years? And my reasoning for wanting to know that time frame goes something like this. So this is a red-cockaded woodpecker. It's a fire-following woodpecker. It's restricted only to post-burn habitats in the southeastern US. This woodpecker, although it's a small bird, it can fly away when the fire comes in, it can hang out somewhere else. It can wait for those lovely pest insects to come back to the trees, and then it can come back in and do its fire following, woodpecker life history. In the Santa Monica Mountains, one of our mesopredator vertebrates, a bobcat, probably at least at the edges of the fire, can take off into unburned areas and come back in once it's recovered. But what about these? This is a pair of alligator lizards that happen to be mating, but it's a pair of small lizards. If a fire burns, these lizards move hundreds of meters in their lifetime. These are not mobile animals. These do not move long distances. And if a fire takes out their habitat, they may well be able to go underground. They may well be able to go into rock piles, get away from the heat, especially if it's not too severe. But they're going to come back out the next day, and this is going to be their habitat. And those lizards, they're reptiles. They might be able to go for a week. They might be able to go for 2 weeks. They cannot go for 3 months without anything to eat. They eat insects. If there's no plants, there's no insects. If there's no insects, the lizards die. Ditto for small mammals. And if lizards and small mammals are gone, the entire snake community collapses. And so there's this whole community of vertebrates as well as many, many invertebrates that where that timing really, really matters. And that's what I wanted to sort of study in my post-burn experiments. So the Woolsey Fire, this is the fire that got me motivated for this. A few facts on it. This is just from a website. It burned in LA and Ventura counties. It ignited on November 8th. It burned just short of 100,000 acres. It destroyed 1,600 plus structures, killed 3 people, and about 300,000 people had to be evacuated from the Santa Monica Mountains as a result of the fire. If you like to look at it more in terms of landscapes, this is what it looks like. And I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, or my arrow. I hope you can. But to the north here is the San Fernando Valley. To the east is LA proper. And this is a very large swath of the Santa Monicas. It's well over half of the entire Santa Monica mountain range. Okay, so what did we do? Well, it took a month or two to kind of get organized. And I contacted a couple of colleagues of mine. One on the left in this figure is John Keeley. I'm sure most of you know John. John is a complete, the expert on fire ecology. He's a botanist working with the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS, in California, Chaparral and Oak Woodland communities. In the middle is Marty Witter. Marty is an equally accomplished fire ecologist and botanist from the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area that oversees the Santa Monica Mountains. And then there's me on the right. I pulled together John and Marty and a few other folks and said, let's get a group of students together and do a sort of community science student project to try and learn as much as we can, as quickly as we can, about the short-term impacts of the Woolsey Fire. And so we put out the word. About 100 students showed up from UCLA, as well as from Cal State Northridge and Pepperdine and USC, all across the LA basin. They showed up, and we put together kits that each student would use to lay out a transect that they would study for the next 6 months. So we did this in February, and we got them out in February. And the idea was from February until the end of classes, which is the end of July, the students would go out and they would lay out transects and come back every month and study the plants. This is, again, the outline of the Woolsey Fire in red. The yellow dots are our 40 transects that were set up. So we had about 100 students. We had 3 agencies. We set up 40 transects. Each one of those transects is 100 meters long. And every 10 meters, there's a plot, a 1 square meter plot. Those are the students' study units. So 400 total plots was the idea. And for each plot, the students were to measure the fire severity using John Keeley's fire severity index, the number of stems, the number of plants that were in each one of their transect plots, the 10 plots on their transect, and the percent cover of plants in that transect. And they were to do it monthly from February to July. Now, of course, we hoped that what we would get is 40 transects, each one of which was sampled 6 times, February through July. They're students. This is all volunteer. Nobody's getting paid. We had some plots some transects where we got data every month for 6 months. Some with 5, some with 4, some with 3, some that where we only got data once. But overall, it's a pretty good study. It's a lot of plots spread across the entire range of the fire. So one of the real challenges, and this was John Keeley's insight or strategy that he's used in the past, is that none of these students are botanists, nor am I, and none of them knew what the plants were. And so the strategy that we used is the student goes to their 1 meter plot, they put it down, they've got flags to mark it, and they see a species of plant. So in this case, it's a golden yarrow. And what they did is they just gave it a name. They called it cute fish tank grass fennel because they thought it was a fennel. And they found an individual from outside of their plot. they taped it onto a 5x7 card and they gave it that name. And forevermore, for every time they went out on every one of their plots, whenever they saw that, they wrote that down in their field notes and they counted the number of stems and the percent cover. And every time they got a new species, they gave it a new name. Here's a Stephanomeria, which is a native genus where the species are hard to tell apart. This particular group called that one Grinch. For Stephanomeria, sometimes we couldn't go to species, so we just worked at the genus level. Here's another one. Someone called it a dandelion. It's not a dandelion. It's not an asteraceae. It's a thistle. But they used those names to identify their species. Translating those names to actual plant species that we could then work with is a non-trivial task. It certainly wasn't one that I was up to because I don't know my plants that well. And this is where Richard came in. Richard is a very, very accomplished botanist, master's student at Cal State Northridge. Richard went through all of those cards, translated the names on those cards to a species identification. We ended up with about 105 different species across our plots and transects. We also had an image for each plot from each transect for each time the students went out. He went to those images. He confirmed if the student said that a certain species was supposed to be in that plot. He looked at the plot to make sure that he could see something there that was it. So he was doing some kind of quality control and then provided us with information on most of the species. So if we get into the data a little bit, here's what it looks like. And I'll just kind of walk you through this a little bit. So this is one transect with 10 plots where we had data for all 6 months for all 10 plots. And you can just see that, you can see sort of the changes in the plots in space. And remember, this is just across 100 meters and also through time. And a couple of things that I just want you to notice. Over this very, very small spatial scale, there are plots like number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, where in February, there was virtually nothing. Okay, there are few stems, but very, very few. There are others on that same transect, like 9, where the fire was much less severe or it jumped over that particular plot, and there was a lot more cover to begin with. In February, though, a lot of the plots were really bare. And remember, the fire was in November, so this is 3 months later, or the short side of 3 months later. There's still an awful lot of bare ground, an awful lot of ground with no plants, therefore presumably no insects, therefore presumably nothing for many of these other small vertebrates to prey upon. By March and April, as spring came in Southern California, in the chaparral and coastal sagebrush scrub communities, plants, native and non-native, started revegetating and filling in to a greater or lesser extent. And then by June and July, as is always the case, just due to natural processes, the transects dry out and the percent cover and number of stems decreases again, sort of naturally. Okay, so what do we get if we just look at the data sort of quickly? And this is a summary where each dot on these plots is a 1 meter square plot. And all the species have been identified for that plot in that month. Remember, month 2 is February, month 7 is July. And what we did was just on the left-hand side here is abundance. That's just the number of stems in the plots. And we just broke it out into relatively native ones and relatively invasive ones. Green being the natives, red being the relatively non-native plots. In the middle is alpha diversity. So that's just species richness. How many species were in that plot? Again, broken out by the predominantly native or non-native ones. And then the right is a Shannon index, which is just a weighted combination of abundance and alpha diversity for those plots. And the only things I really want to say here are that there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of plots where there's a lot of natives. There's a lot of plots where there's fewer natives. We don't see any obvious trends in terms of changes in the proportions of red and green in these plots. And we don't see a lot of change in the abundances or the alpha diversities over time. We see a drop off in abundances that correlates with the season. But other than that, the means of these box plots, which is the black bars going across the middle of them, they're pretty stable over time, which I found interesting. If we look in a little more detail, and I'm just going to show you 3 of the transects where we have full data across all 10 plots and every time course. If we look at that, what we see is we get a message of heterogeneity. So what these plots are showing is annual, perennials, and shrubs. The thing I really want to emphasize here is the nativeness, where for each one of these lines, if it's a dotted line, it's non-native, and if it's a solid line, it's natives. Okay, and on the y-axis is always number of stems. And there's, as I say, just a tremendous amount of heterogeneity. So if you look at plot 1, the total number of stems in plot 1 is the sum at any given month of those dots. There's 50, 60, 80 stems. You move 10 meters away and there's a handful of stems. So there's tremendous heterogeneity across these across different plots within transects. If you look at another transect, and this might be a mile or 2 away, we just picked ones where we had good data. Some transects are clearly really dominated by non-natives. Remember, the dotted lines are the non-natives, and they're almost all annuals, or they're virtually all annuals. And so here, whether it's plot 1, plot 2, or plot 7, whatever, the dominant is always the dotted lines, that is the non-native annuals. There are other transects, again, where we didn't see a single non-native. Everything that came back in was native. And there's a lot of individuals in some cases, plot 2, plot 3. There's a lot of stems and a lot of plants coming in. So again, there's heterogeneity within transects across plots. There's heterogeneity in terms of transects where there's a lot of non-natives. There's heterogeneity in terms of ones where there's a lot of natives. And that sort of surprised me a bit. If we summarize that information across all of the plots, and we just look at, this is just looking at abundance, we have native and non-native for annual, perennial, and shrub species. And again, maybe this is my naivete, but I found this as a conservation biologist incredibly hopeful and sort of almost uplifting that yes, in the annual category, sure, there are a lot of non-native annuals that are coming in, but there's more natives. And there's a lot of natives. And when you get into the perennials and the shrubs, it's essentially all natives. And that for me was just a very, very satisfying, really kind of wonderful result. It means that even in the relatively modified habitats of the Santa Monica Mountains, we're in kind of, there's a lot of native diversity, and a lot of it is coming back from fire. In terms of fire,
you can wrap it up so we can.
Oh, okay. I thought I had 20 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been 25.
No, it's been 19 by my watch.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe yeah.
Okay. Okay. Anyhow, in terms of fire followers, we see the kind of expected pattern of a lot of fire followers, all of which are native. And so that's kind of wonderful. And in terms of fire severity, these are the last data that I think I'll be showing you. The severity, which goes from 0, which is a very low severity, to over 100, which is high severity. And we can either look at the whole range of that, or we can just look at the main bulk of it, which is severity from 0 to about 50. There is a relationship between the number of stems that come back and the severity of the fire. It's not a hugely informative relationship, but there is one. And it certainly says that the lower the severity, the more stems come back in over time. This is just for February. So my take-home points from this is that, to my perhaps surprise and real, I'm very, very pleased to find this. There's lots of heterogeneity across plots within transects, across plots over time, and across transects. Natives are often more abundant than invasives. The mechanisms, at least as far as I know, and what I've talked to John Keeley about and Marty Witter, are not always clear. Is that just an effect of what it was like before the fire, or other factors? Is often not clear, but it's really important if our goal is perhaps to even use fire to reduce non-natives. I think given the data, especially at the very beginning of the study, where there is so much bare ground, so much area where there's not going to be insects, there's not going to be prey for small vertebrates, there's likely going to be very severe short-term impacts, both for ground-dwelling invertebrates and also for small vertebrates that prey on them. And those short-term impacts may well have long-term consequences in terms of the genetic composition and turnover of those populations, which we can talk about more if you like, and is something that I work on quite a bit. So that's as much as I have to say. Thanks again to the USGS, the National Park Service, the Mountains Restoration Trust, to about 100 very, very dedicated undergraduates who did this all for free. They did it just because they wanted to learn. And to Russ Fawcett, a really wonderful individual who was a private contributor and funder to the project. And I'll stop with that.
Thanks a lot, Brad. All right, so I'm going to introduce our panel members, and then remember you can put your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll answer as many as we can at the end. So our panel members for this section are Lisa Gonzalez-Kramer. She's an environmental scientist and reforestation project management at Cuyamaca Rancho State Park. And then we have Joseph Algieris. He is a restoration ecologist at Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. So I see, actually don't see Lisa. Oh yeah, there you are. Okay, so Lisa, you want to start? You're muted. Lisa, you're muted.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Hey, just to clarify, as a panel member, I did prepare some slides, but my talk would be more than 5 minutes, and I'm not sure that I want to be cognizant of the time here. So, what do you suggest? I think it's going to be about 8 minutes.
We have 10 minutes until the end of this whole workshop. So.
Okay. All right. Okay. And Joseph has probably a 5 minutes as well.
Have several minutes. I don't have any slides prepared, but I was just going to share some of the results. So it's up to you. I'm happy if you would like to share your slides.
Yeah, Joseph, you want to go first, and then I'll wrap up because I think I might have not enough time to go through everything. So
absolutely. So I'm the restoration ecologist with the National Park Service for Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. I've been with the park for 16 years now and been through several fires. The Woolsey Fire, as Brad mentioned, is the largest fire that we've experienced. It burned about 90% of Park Service land. And so when that fire was going on, we were thinking about primarily invasive plant control and how are we going to carry out this huge invasive plant control project across most of Park Service land. We partnered up with Cal State's parks and with MRCA as well, this Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority. And we treated probably about 1,800 gross acres across the mountains. We had a great crew. They surveyed probably over 4,000 acres. We went to areas that we knew were problem areas from past data. And probably the most interesting thing that we found was that those areas with a strong treatment history showed great results after the fire. So, in the post-fire environment, this is really an opportunity for invasive species to capitalize on open substrate, open sunlight, nutrient-rich soils. And in those areas where we had done extensive treatments, we did not see a rebound to pre-treatment levels. And that's something that is concerning. You do all this work and you see these great results, and then you worry, well, the next disaster that comes through here might just kind of undo all your work. But that clearly wasn't the case. We saw a small spike, which you would expect, but nothing back to pre-treatment levels. And then the other interesting thing that we did was we looked at restoration sites. There is a history of restoration sites that had been burned. I mean, we had 14 different locations, and we had some really great student interns come out and collect data on how those restoration sites are recovering. We haven't analyzed the data yet, but the gist of it is that some of these older restoration sites recover just like intact, native plant communities. If they've been there for long enough, 10, 15 years, they've had enough time to become mature shrubs and replenish the seed bank. And they respond like you would expect for them to respond. So the take-home message is to do this restoration work, invasive plant control and restoration, because it does pay off. There's mitigating effects that happen, and we're making everything easier for the resource managers of the future. That's it for me.
Thanks so much, Joseph. Lisa, if you'd like to share, I know you said that you had about 8 minutes of content, but if you'd like to maybe just lightly touch on a few things, so we can just leave a couple minutes in there to squeeze any last questions at the end, if that sounds okay.
Sure. Well, yeah. Can you be the timekeeper for me? That'd be great.
Certainly.
Thank you. All right. I am going to share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Lisa Gonzalez Kramer. I'm an environmental scientist and project manager for the Cuyamaca Rancho State Park Reforestation Project, which was initiated after the 2003 Cedar Fire. The project started 4 years post-fire and has been occurring for a little over 14 years now. My goal today is to give you a brief overview of the fire and immediate post-fire conditions, and then discuss our restoration work and impart some strategies that we've used that you can employ, hopefully to achieve success in your respective restoration efforts. So Cuyamaca Rancho State Park is a 25,000 acre mountain park in eastern San Diego County. Prior to the fire, it held 10,000 acres of forested habitat in the mountains, the eastern mountain, the mountains of eastern San Diego County at the headwaters of 3 watersheds. And it held approximately 28% of San Diego County's mixed conifer habitat, existing as sky islands in the peninsular mountain range. This is the Cedar Fire footprint. It burned over 270,000 acres. It was the largest wildfire in California's recorded history for 14 years until the Thomas Fire occurred in 2003. And you can see the park is highlighted in green here. So the fire burned at high intensity over thousands of contiguous acres, and that is what made it a catastrophic fire. This is a landscape view after the fire. You can see complete loss of the canopy. It didn't leave a mosaic of low, medium, and high intensity burn areas like would have occurred in a fire of less intensity. We had 95% of conifer species died, and the park suffered a catastrophic loss of the ability of the conifer forest to regenerate through cone production. We also lost the forest duff. It was incinerated down to bare mineral soil. So there was no seed bank left on the forest floor, and consequently no ability for the conifers to regenerate from an existing seed bank. So what remained after the fire was about 100 acres of mature forest on Cuyamaca Peak. And Cuyamaca Peak also holds the last remaining sugar pine stand in San Diego County. There are other forested patches, but actually they're just pockets of conifer stands around the campgrounds, but these stands could not be defined as forest habitat. So with that, I want to, in the interest of time, I want to identify for you our recommendations for long-term success, keeping in mind that long-term is relative and that climate change will continue to shift the variables and add to the complexity of your work. So your greatest success long-term is obviously dependent upon your early decisions and considerations. And so these are the aspects I'll be focusing on, and hopefully in 100 years, someone will be able to say that we made the right choices. So you're going to first identify, evaluate, and prioritize the resources on your land that need protection, considering sensitive species, endemic species, and observed or predicted range shifts. So for us, our goals were to protect our living nursery, restore the native habitat, restore biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, connectivity of habitat and nutrient cycling, and to manage for wildfires and threats of invasive species. Things that we consider as we're propagating these, as we're doing this, is the microsite conditions such as slope, aspect, elevation, accessibility, and distance to the nearest seed source. We're going to propagate seedlings from the remaining nursery trees and reforest within the footprint of the original forested habitat, planting a mosaic of sites that will serve as centers of seed dispersal, because conifers are wind propagated, and so they need nearby neighbors to propagate. And then we're also planting at densities that will enhance resilience to catastrophic wildfires.
I'm so sorry to break in right now, Lisa, because this is really cool and interesting, but we're running short on time. So
okay,
perhaps maybe one last closing thought to leave with everyone.
Yeah, I would say that when you are planting or restoring for long term, you're obviously going to consider your climate shifts and drought and species, not just densities, but types. And then my biggest takeaway here, I want to scroll forward. As you're deciding on species and seed lots for long-term restoration, I would highly recommend the seed lot selection tool developed by the U.S. Forest Service, Oregon State University, and Conservation Biology Institute. It is very helpful for information and predictions about the climate adaptability of plant material to climatic conditions of potential reforestation or restoration sites. So that's the biggest thing I would say. And also contact me if you have questions for long-term post-fire restoration.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Joseph and Brad. As people can put, you can put any question if you want. Meanwhile, I want to let everyone know that today's webinar and the next week's field day are both supported with funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation in partnership with the Andrews National Forest. So we really appreciate our sponsors. And we want to ask you if you can fill out our webinar evaluation survey in Anika, sorry, just put it in the chat. That will really help us improve and bring you more and better webinars and workshops for you. Also, if you Yeah, no, that's it, I think. And someone is asking for Lisa's email, and Anika just put it in the chat. It's over there, so you can actually contact her.